that it had it 95% correct and that the other 5% would arrive in 5 years' time. All were wrong. All were wrong, and we gaze back at their naivete with a faint sense of our own superiority. But we are wrong. We don't have it either. I mean, if this is a culture approaching the truth, who needs the truth? I mean, this is something very, very different. Well, then, just to satisfy myself, I asked the question, why should it be like this? Why should these psychedelics, which granted perturb the mind, be such a terrifying contra-cultural force? And what does that mean? Well, I think it works something like this. Your sensory apparatus connected up to your local language is a very good threat detection device. And that is really what the animal body evolved to be. We wouldn't be here if we weren't at the end of a long line of superb threat detection devices which told us when the saber-toothed carnivore was sneaking on its belly through the tall grass, which gave us that moment out of the corner of our eye when we saw the edge movement and scampered back into the cave, and so forth and so on. So ordinary consciousness has evolved an extraordinary fit to three-dimensional space and time, because that's where your soma, your meat, is. And if the meat is disrupted radically, the mind is we don't know where. That's somebody else's lecture. It's very important to keep the physical body together. So the mind, under the influence of culture and cultural values, evolves as a threat detection device. But notice that carried far enough, that ends in paranoia. So then, in a sense, all cultural values carried to their ultimate end produce the paranoid personality. Fearful, watchful, never resting, never sleeping, always looking for the worst in every situation. But the mind is like water. It takes the shape of the vessel into which it is poured, always. So when we approach the psychedelic plants as shamans, as seekers, as sincere people interested in extraordinary experiences, what the psychedelics do, I think, is dissolve this three-dimensional threat detection, psychology, and system, and it's as though the mind discovers that it has a second conformational geometry. That's a way of putting it. And this second conformational geometry is of a higher dimensional order than ordinary consciousness. Not as a metaphor, higher dimensional order, but as a mathematician would use that term. The psychedelic mind is a higher dimensional mind. It is not fit for three-dimensional space-time filled with roving, heavy-bodied carnivores. But it is fit for the back of the cave, the mountain retreat, the monastic tower. In other words, the place where threat has been eliminated and philosophy is the order of the day. And so my interpretation of these psychedelic states is that they are actually higher dimensional states of consciousness. And I put this to Ralph Abraham, the mathematician, who is no mathematical slouch and no psychedelic slouch either. And we talked of this in relationship to DMT. And he said, I have no doubt at all that when I am flashing on DMT, I am seeing the ordinary world from a higher dimensional mathematical perspective. And one of the things about higher dimensions is that the linearity of time is overcome. And last week and next week are as easily available as the present moment. The front of my hand is as easily seen as the back of my hand without moving my hand if I am in hyperspace. So in a way, these higher dimensions are the places from which knowledge has percolated. and shamans related to the smith, the worker in metal, the technologist, the tool maker. These are the twin brothers, the two aspects of the shaman. The shaman is a master of fire, master of metals, maker of tools, seer into the future, so forth and so on. The shaman is outside of cultural time and is, I don't like this word, but channeling the future which is to come in the form of technologies, innovations, languages, behaviors, so forth and so on. And this is why the shaman has always been the paradigmatic figure for Aboriginal cultures, because the shaman knows more, and the method of the shaman has always been perturbation of consciousness. Not always psychedelic plants or substances. Can be hooking metal hooks under your pectoral muscles and hanging for 14 hours in the sun. Can be abandonment in the wilderness. Can be extreme forms of fasting. Can be ordeal poisons. But people are not fools. All of these things are extremely risky and unpleasant, while the psychedelics are the most effective and the least invasive. I mean, let's take 30 milligrams of psilocybin or a great fistful of mushrooms. 3 hours into it, you are definitely thrown into the lap of God. 8 hours into it, you're simply looking back on it, reflecting, drawing conclusions, and wondering where do you go from here. So this is a roundabout way of explaining. It's no surprise to me that society is very nervous around this issue, because society's eggs are all in one basket, and the psychedelically inspired citizen or the psychedelically inspired shaman is a dangerous force. Even in traditional societies, the shaman is central to the social functioning and the health and so forth, but is never allowed to be physically central. There's a leader, a headman or something. The shaman lives off at the edge of the village, sometimes off in the woods. He is approached with fear and trembling. He is loathed and respected and feared and loved, because it is understood that he represents a dimension that nevertheless must be tolerated, because it is the channel through which knowledge and healing and higher values come. Now, in a society like ours, we say we have other methods. We don't need the ravings of intoxicated shamans. We have the scientific method. We have the gospel. We have the Talmud. We have all of these things, and they are sufficient for us to guide ourselves. But to guide ourselves where? The 20th century, if the 20th century is a statement of the accomplishments of the Western mind, values, and methods, then God help us. Because the 20th century is a disgrace, and to this moment, a disgrace. It was so comfortable to look back at Auschwitz and say, well, the 30s, the 40s, Hitler, those gray, grainy movies, this has nothing to do with us. This is just some terrible thing that happened in Europe 50 years ago. No. This is happening. It's happening as we speak. People are being pushed into boxcars and taken away to be lined up and shot for no reason whatsoever, while glasses tinkle and toasts are made by those who define themselves as the preservers of freedom, dignity, and Western value. We haven't learned anything. The 20th century is the most condemnatory piece of evidence you can place against the Western mind, and it seems to me it's a knockout punch. I don't know who's responsible for this, but whoever is responsible is guilty of crimes against humanity. How do we overcome this? How do we find real values? Well, we find them in caring for the earth. Nature presents an established set of processes and achievements, billions of years old, which exercise a moral claim on rational intelligence, if it will but notice. And so that's what this is all about. It's